Welcome to the fourth episode of Beyond the Desk, a podcast of West Dallas Public Library, where we talk about books, resources, lifelong learning, and what makes our community great. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'm joined by your other host, Elizabeth. We're both librarians at West Dallas Public Library, and in this episode, we'll talk about our new favorite historical mystery series, Abir Mukherjee's Wyndham and Banerjee Mysteries, set in 1920s India. So for me, during the most difficult part of the stay-at-home period last year, I kind of got stuck on a book that I was reading. I was doing more listening to audiobooks, and then I returned to a mystery series that I had started the previous fall, and I just really got into mysteries and kind of haven't stopped, and I feel like the mystery genre and kind of cozy mysteries, which I would consider the Wyndham and Banerjee mysteries to kind of be in that subgenre, that really got me through some difficult times, and I think other people too.
Yes, although I have to say this was my first mystery that I read during the pandemic, and surprising because I did really enjoy it, and I don't know why I don't read more mysteries, so maybe that's what I need to do after this series. But I initially was looking at Nancy Pearl's website and just to see what she was reading, and this was the first one was what she was reading.
A Rising Man.
Yes, A Rising Man was the title that she had mentioned, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go. And I raced through it, read the second one, and I forget, was I reading the third one when I told you about the series already?
You had read a couple of them, or were into the second one at least.
Yeah. And I was so enjoying it that I just needed to tell somebody, like, you should read this series. I hadn't heard about it, and yeah, I'm so glad I found it.
Well, and I'm glad you turned me on to the series. I had heard of it beforehand, and I didn't, I was reading other things, so it was kind of on my radar, but when you told me that you really enjoyed it so much, I knew that I had to read it, and we thought it would be a great, make a good episode to talk about the series together. And I kind of had the same experience that you did with the first one. It really is very engaging, and you kind of want to read it all at once. I think maybe I read it in a few days, but really it's very suspenseful. It's a fun read.
Yes. I think definitely it works in the complete escapist kind of genre. Different setting, different time period, completely different world experience. But I'm also interested in historical fiction, so it really worked with that very well. And I enjoyed the character. I enjoyed Sam Wyndham.
Yeah, I liked both Sam Wyndham and Sergeant Banerjee. I also I thought this was a little different for me because I don't read a lot of historical mysteries. The mysteries that I read tend to be contemporary. So I liked that aspect, and I didn't know that much about Indian history or the relationship between India and England, and so I found it very fascinating, and that's an aspect of the books that I think is really strong. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Yes, it gives you an insight into a different world that you might not be familiar with, and I think you can learn something new about other people, and I enjoy reading from that point of view too.
Yes, I think that's one of the great things about, even if you can't travel yourself, books take you to different places and different time periods, and this is certainly a series that, with the Calcutta setting, you learn a little bit about that city, about the history, and then you get to go other places in the series as well.
Yes, absolutely.
I think if you enjoy not only mysteries reading them, but also masterpiece mysteries on PBS, which I know there are some people who come into the library who are fans, and I am, and people in my family are as well. I really hope that at some point they make the series into a masterpiece series, because I feel like it would be perfectly suited and it would be fun to see the characters come to life that way.
Oh, yes. Yeah, if you enjoy that British mystery genre, this will be so well suited to you. Yeah.
Yeah, and before that happens, if that ever happens, you can get caught up on the books.
Yes.
I wonder if we should take a step back and just kind of explain the series, because we're talking about, right now there are 4 novels in the series, and Wyndham is kind of the focus of them. He's the narrator. He comes from England. He was in the First World War and has experienced some trauma with so many of his comrades not making it through the end of the war. And he also married his wife Sarah before the war, but they didn't get to have much time together before he had to go off and fight. And it turns out that when he gets back, Sarah has not made it because she suffered from the flu pandemic that was going on at that time. And so he is just, I think, in a way lost and hurt. And so he gets an opportunity to do some police work in India, and he goes for it. And that's how kind of the series starts in the first book, A Rising Man. And then Banerjee is a sergeant who works with Wyndham. And he is an interesting character. I really like him. He is an Indian man, and he studied in England. Do you remember, did he go to Cambridge? Is that right? Or am I not getting that correct? I don't remember, but he was educated at an English university, right?
That's interesting. That rings a bell, Cambridge, but
Okay, I don't know if that's correct, but he definitely went to one of the universities, right?
It wasn't Oxford.
No, I don't
So I think it must have been Cambridge.
He speaks with kind of a British accent, right? Is that my understanding?
It's interesting you say that, because as you read it, you kind of assume a lot about how they sound. Just as a reader, you kind of put your own pronunciations on things. So I think they do say that he does speak with an English accent.
I feel like they make a point of saying that he speaks English very beautifully.
Okay.
I don't know what his accent is precisely. He seems to be, even though he's Indian, very much in some ways a part of the British establishment, or because he's working as a sergeant and works with Wyndham for the police. And that kind of plays out interestingly later on. But those are the 2 main characters. I think maybe just making sure we mention the other books is a good idea. So the second one is called A Necessary Evil. And then the third book is Smoke and Ashes. And the fourth one is Death in the East. And that's the last one that is currently available. The 5th book, The Shadows of Men, comes out here in November. So I'm looking forward to reading that as well. In addition to it being set in India, which is really great, it's also in the 1920s about. The first book is in 1919. Can you talk a little bit about the history just briefly for us?
Absolutely. Yes, so 1920s, it's a very specific time in Indian history. It's a point in Indian history known as the British Raj or Raj era India. And the Raj time period is between 1858 and 1947. And it actually extended past India to Bangladesh and Pakistan. So it included all three of those countries that we know of today as independent from each other, but they were all part of this one area. And the reason why we have a lot of English influences and relationships between India and the British is because at the time, Queen Victoria of England was also known as the Empress of India. And there are some differences in how India was ruled as opposed to the other Commonwealth countries around the globe. There was a difference, but there was definitely a close relationship between India and the British. It makes sense that Sergeant Banerjee was sent to England to get his post-secondary education because he would have needed that elevation of language and that understanding of British culture in order to function really well in India at the time. So there was a lot of cross-cultural back and forth between the two, that a special relationship. Not always the easiest relationship, and I think what we see in the time period that we read with these novels is that there were some issues with this relationship between India and the British, and the Indians were starting to chafe at how they were being treated because they weren't treated as equals.
No, and that plays out in the books.
Yes.
I would say, to me, I wasn't very familiar with this history, but reading the books, I think, makes you interested in learning more about that time and place, and about the relationship between Britain and India. And it does play out in interesting ways. I wouldn't say that they're overly political, but there is that aspect to some parts of the book. In particular, I feel like it starts coming out in the third book because there's a mention of Gandhi and then his associates.
Yeah, and the nonviolent peaceful protest movement, and then the questions of Sergeant Banerjee's allegiances.
Yes.
Is he a true Indian, or is he actually just pretending? Where does his loyalty lie? And that starts to play out further and get more reflected upon.
Yes, and you get that sense that it will continue to be. In fact, I think that I saw an interview with the author who was explaining how in the first books they do take place kind of a book a year kind of thing, like they've been coming out a book a year. And so the first one's in 1919, the second one's in 1920, etc. And I think he had plans to kind of go through 47. And I don't know if he's going to continue at the pace of one per year, but that is kind of where he's headed. And then in the fourth book, which I really enjoyed because I felt like it had it amped up the mystery a bit, and the author has said that he was influenced by Agatha Christie and wanted to do a locked door mystery where part of the trick is that the door is locked. So how did somebody come in and leave if the door is locked and the victim is inside the room? Anyway, in that book, we see a difference. We see a change in Banerjee. He starts out in the series very young and inexperienced, and that kind of contrasts with Wyndham's experience. I don't know the difference in age, if they're maybe like 15 years or so apart. I don't know exactly, but that's kind of my sense of.
Yeah, it feels that
at least
you
10
have the
years.
older leading the younger, and the one much more experienced and kind of hardened by life,
Yes.
leading somebody who's quite green and inexperienced with women and inexperienced talking to superiors and understanding political agendas when you're talking to different people in the police force. So, yeah.
And yet he has really insightful ideas into the cases, which I think
Sergeant Banerjee does, yes.
Yes. I think that definitely helps Wyndham, and it's part of why Wyndham really likes him. But it's also interesting. You're absolutely right about how Wyndham is a little cynical about things. He also, I think, realizes in living in India how he sees people differently and doesn't see the Indian people, native to the country, as equals. And so that gets explored a bit. And it's interesting that he does have that self-awareness, and sometimes I think his relationship with Banerjee makes him realize that, he has some of these prejudices too.
Yes, working so closely with him, I think he starts out with a little bit of sympathy for him already, as opposed to another police officer in the first book who nicknames Sergeant Banerjee with kind of a derogatory kind of play on his first name, and he calls him Surrender Not instead of his true name, which is Surrender Nath or Surrender Nut. And because he can't get his tongue around Sergeant Banerjee's first name, he just kind of dismisses it and gives him a silly other nickname. And Sam Wyndham doesn't. He doesn't treat him that way initially. I think there are some biases in Sam Wyndham for sure. And as you read through until the fourth book, you start to see them play out, and you realize that Sam Wyndham has quite a few gaps, or that he's starting to realize his gaps more and more, and that he realizes that he hasn't been really respecting his sergeant as he could have been.
But I think that Wyndham's respect for Banerjee grows. And then in the fourth book, Banerjee shows up wearing native dress, and normally he'd be wearing, he's on vacation at first, and then he's called into the case, and he's not wearing his uniform, and I think that's a signal that there's something that has changed inside him as well. And he had spent some time with relatives, an aunt, I believe, and so he comes back, and I think that this is kind of where the series is headed, to explore that a little bit more.
I found that very interesting, actually. I thought that was a really interesting development in that fourth book. And then he's always taken a secondary kind of role, like an observer or a helper. And in the fourth book, he actually has to do the questioning of the witnesses, and he has to lead the process of interrogation. And Sam Wyndham is witness to how people of his nation treat Banerjee, and it's kind of putting a spotlight on himself as well, going, do I treat him that way as well? And also having to defend his sergeant in those moments and say, no, he is the one you need to answer to, and you don't have any choice. Yeah.
It's also interesting, that book is Death in the East is the fourth book, and it is a little bit of a departure in that, or I should say it's different from the previous three, because there are two storylines, which I found really interesting, and it also kind of heightens the suspense. Not that the other ones weren't suspenseful, but I like that technique of kind of alternating timelines and storylines. And so one of the storylines takes place in 1905 in the East End of London, and that's when Wyndham is a young officer. And then So we didn't talk about this yet, but he has an opium addiction.
Yes.
And then he's getting, in the fourth book, he is going to an ashram in India to get treatment, which is he's going to go through this process to basically withdrawal from the opium addiction. And that's where the second storyline takes place, first in the ashram, and then there's a body that's found kind of in the vicinity, and then he is gone from the ashram. He stays with a local person and interacts with a couple of people that he did meet on the ashram, or at the ashram first. And then Banerjee's kind of called in, and it felt like when Banerjee was called in, kind of like the detective trope of like he was the detective on the case, like you were saying.
Yes.
So even though they were working together and still do, I mean, they're talking about the case together, Banerjee is the detective who's in charge of the case.
Yeah, he's forced into that position because Wyndham is on a sabbatical.
Yes.
So he cannot be the one to do the interrogation himself. And there's a lot more, I would say there's a lot more action or tension in number 4 in knowing the one storyline and what happened, and basically the characters that Wyndham meets at that point, and then sort of a continuation of that storyline in the second one. Yes. Not to give too much away.
Well, I think we can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah.
There's this idea that he thinks he sees somebody, a familiar face, and so you know that there's going to be eventually a connection there. But it's also, I think, rich in other ways. It's not just about who is the familiar face and how do these stories connect, but also Wyndham, when he was younger and he was on this case, he was deeply affected by the outcome. It turns out that the first case in 1905 in London, a woman is found murdered, and actually there's a double locked room mystery, because she is found in a locked room, and he had a connection to her. He actually dated her before she ended up meeting another suitor and getting married, and so I think he had helped her before, shortly before she died. She was attacked, and then when she is found murdered, I think he has this close connection and really wants justice for her. And I think part of that is him being young and idealistic, and part of it is his connection to that woman. And anyway, I think I really enjoyed the fourth one in particular. I also, I don't know what you thought about some of the other ones, but I liked that the second one also takes place in another part of India. The primary location for the series is Kolkata, and that's a big city, and that's where Wyndham and Banerjee are police officers. But the second book takes place in another part of India. It has a different feel to it. It's
a kingdom in the north, Sambalpur, and it's got tigers and elephants and diamond mines and harems and you name it. It's much more, it feels a lot more exotic.
Yeah, and I enjoyed that. I really liked that setting too, and I felt like in some ways, I mean, of course, no two cities are the same, cities are unique, but you kind of get the sense of, okay, this is a city, and you have some ideas of what that is, even if it's in another part of the world and you haven't been there. But I really enjoyed the setting of the second book because it was different, and it really felt like being transported
Yes.
somewhere totally different.
And if the author continues to write a book a year, maybe, hopefully, we'll get to see a whole lot of different places in India, because I know it is a very many and varied country.
It's big too.
It's huge. One part of India is not the same as another part.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that one was very different in flavor from the other three.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe it?
It almost felt, because it was so different, it felt almost fantastical to me, like all the diamond mines. Like it was very, fantasy,
Okay.
Yeah. So I enjoyed it, but I think I had a different relationship with that book.
It was a little much all in one. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to get out of the city, so I enjoyed that one.
Yes. Yeah. Kolkata kind of just the opium addiction that plays out was very much tied to Kolkata in my mind.
Yes.
And so getting away to that other place, it wasn't as big of a theme in the second one in a way.
It was a reprieve.
Yes. It wasn't he wasn't continually running away from police or trying to escape or trying to find the opium den, and
because he doesn't always go to the same one, so it's
yes.
And he goes out late at night because he can't sleep, and partly that's because of the opium.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be why I liked the second one. The opium wasn't as big of a
he definitely paints a picture of a grungy kind of seedy, dark lifestyle, and Wyndham doesn't really want to be addicted. He fights it, and he tries to let it go as long as he can before he realizes that he can't sleep and he needs to have something. And should we say something about why he becomes addicted?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Was it because he was being treated for something medically, and then the addiction just was a natural result from that? And
well, I think it goes back to him being a veteran of the First World War. Mm-hmm. At the time, of course, it's the Great War. Mm-hmm. And he was, I believe, injured, and mm-hmm. I think they said he was on morphine or something like that mm-hmm. initially, and he ends up taking opium, but it's very much related to his war experience. Mm-hmm. And then I think he's also struggling with grief, the loss of his wife, even though he didn't know her very well. Now he's mm-hmm. all alone. Mm-hmm. Not only did he lose friends in the war, but he lost his wife, and he's by himself. I think he, if he were, from today, we would say he has PTSD. Mm-hmm. And he's using opium. And in the first book, even though there are these scenes of him seeking out the opium, he does seem to, he at least thinks he has it under control.
Yes.
You can tell that he doesn't quite have things under control, but mm-hmm. he's not as bad off in the first book. But he's not dealing with the grief and loss and anger and all of the complicated feelings mm-hmm. from the war and its aftermath. Instead, he's taking himself to another country, kind of escaping things literally, mm-hmm. and then he uses opium to, I think, tamp down these uncomfortable feelings. And I think partly it's, think of our current problem with people's addiction to painkillers. I think it kind of started out maybe like that. Like mm-hmm. he was in genuine pain and physical pain, and then he started using opium to treat his emotional pain. And so I think, we kind of talked informally when you first mentioned the story to me, mm-hmm. or this series, that it seems very relevant mm-hmm. to today's audience. That's one thing that I really like about, even though it is this kind of historical time period, you still get these issues, a lot of issues that are still relevant today.
Yes, yes, it feels very modern in some ways because you are dealing with a flawed main character. He's quite self-reflective. You're seeing the world through his eyes, and you're dealing with things like racism and addiction to drugs and political issues and PTSD and
immigration too.
Immigration, prejudices,
Yeah.
self-identity. Yeah, it feels very relevant, but it's also beautifully written in many ways. You know, it wasn't hard to read from that perspective. It drew me in right from the beginning, because I remember reading it and going, I'll give this a try, and really enjoying the style of how it's written. And it pulled me in from the start, and then it grips you, and then it takes you for a ride, and then you really want to read that fifth book. I'm looking forward to when it comes out. I'm interested to know if he's kicked his opium addiction.
Oh, you think that he hasn't?
I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of
Because if he has kicked it, it'll be a very different, well, maybe slightly different story.
I feel like he did kick it, but he hasn't been tested because he hasn't been in his
home environment.
Normal.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
He isn't back in Kolkata. He doesn't have those same connections with those opium den barons. And yeah, one of the things I was thinking about was, if you've finished all the series, what are you going to do next? And because I worry about that as a librarian. I don't want to leave people hanging. So I looked into a couple of options. One, if you really enjoyed the mystery piece and the India as a setting piece, you might enjoy the Perveen Mystery series written by Sujata Massey. The first book in the series is The Widows of Malabar Hill, set in 1920s India, Bombay, featuring a female lawyer who's a sleuth, and she goes about trying to investigate a suspicious will that is not taking care of the 3 wives of a recently deceased man.
Okay.
So interesting, yeah. And then there are 2 more that follow in that series. The most recent one of that series, The Bombay Prince, just came out this June.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
so
I'm going
it's
to
a
have to look
recent
into
one.
that.
Yeah, I actually can't wait, because now my appetite has been whetted because of this series. The other suggestion, and I have to say I haven't read this, but it does seem to fit very well into the genre of historical fiction set in India, but also has the opium piece, if that was something that was interesting to you. It's the Ibis trilogy by Amitav Ghosh, and the first book is about the outbreak of the first Opium War between Great Britain and China in around 1839 to 1842. So not necessarily a mystery, but definitely that kind of flavor of setting.
That sounds really interesting, because I know that they do kind of mention China here and there because of the opium. And so I think it would be interesting to kind of see how that would play out, or to learn a little bit more about that through fiction. Because I like nonfiction as well, but I kind of veer toward the narrative nonfiction or memoir.
Me
and
too.
So I like, in terms of learning about history, kind of the historical fiction is interesting to me.
Yes, and I know some of our readers really like to delve deeply into certain points in this in their reading. So those are my 2 recommendations.
Well, I'll add something. I haven't read it yet, but when I was doing some research into this series and the author, I found out that he does a podcast with another author. Their podcast is called the Red Hot Chili Writers, and it's primarily done with the author Wasim Khan, and he has written the Baby Ganesh Detective Agency series, which features an elephant, which I think sounds really fun. He's also just starting the Malabar House historical crime novels, which I believe that the first one will be available in the U.S. this summer.
Okay.
And so I have requested from another library in the system the first Baby Ganesh Detective Agency book. That one is not a historical one. His second series is a historical crime series, but the first one is a contemporary mystery series set in India. So I think that'll be fun.
Fun. Wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Desk with your hosts Sarah and Elizabeth. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the Wyndham and Banerjee mysteries by Abir Mukherjee. You can find the book titles we discussed in the show notes. Head to westdallaslibrary.org for more information and click on the podcast icon. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a review. We hope you'll join us next month when Elizabeth and guest librarian Mary discuss some of their favorite cooking memoirs. That's all for this episode. See you next time.